couple of weeks ago, I came across a video, and this video was listed as the video that's going to answer one of life's most troubling or most difficult questions. And the question that the two gentlemen in the video were discussing, and it was good-natured, but they were arguing over the question of, are fish wet? Now that's probably an interesting question, maybe not a question you have thought of before, maybe you have. Maybe this is a question you can talk about with whoever you're watching this with, but the question was, are fish wet? Now one guy had the opinion that fish are wet no matter where they are. So if they're in water, they're wet. If they come out of the water and have some water on them, then they are wet. Another guy said that the fish are only wet in water. Once they come out, they are now dry. And so you watch this video and you get to the end of it and you think they're going to give you an answer, and it really is inconclusive. They don't really know how to answer the question. And that's probably where we're going to end up too if we try to answer this question. It's not a life's most difficult question, but it's probably something that we have pondered before. But I wonder how fish would answer that question. Now, if we were to go and ask a fish if a fish could actually talk, right, how would they answer that question? You know, I think to myself of like how they would answer, and maybe they wouldn't give an answer, because my guess would be is that maybe that they're simply unaware of it. Maybe it's not something that they just don't think about. It's something that they are just in. Now, in a similar way, you know, there's something that we don't often talk about. There's something that we are unaware of at times. And many times we have no clue what it is because we are just in it. And what it is it's our worldview. And here's a definition of what a worldview is. It's a comprehensive view of life through which we think, understand, and judge, and which determines our approach to life and meaning. Now, if you're still maybe unsure of what a worldview is, a lot of where our worldview comes out is when we start to think about or try to answer some of the more purpose-driven questions. The questions like, why am I here? Or who am I? What's my purpose on this earth? What is the goal of my life? Where is my eternal destiny? Is there eternal destiny? Is there a God? Is there right and wrong? And how do I determine what is right and what is wrong? So we start thinking about all these types of questions, and that's when our worldview really begins to come out. And whether we acknowledge it or not, whether we realize it or not, now we all have one. Yet it's a very difficult thing to define. In my opinion, this question of what's your worldview, I think this would be a question that would stump all of us in a job interview. You know, we often go into a job interview prepared. All right? We kind of anticipate the questions that are going to be asked of us. But then, you know, maybe there's always a ballpark question or a question that is really hard to answer, and this would be one of them. If they were to look at you and say, you know, what is your worldview? You might need a little bit of time to think about it. You may not have a good answer for them in that moment, right? Or even a one-sentence description of what your worldview might be. But it's hard to define. But yet it is something that is a part of all of us and affects every area of our lives. Our worldview, how we look at the world, how we navigate this world, affects our money, right? How we spend it. It affects our priorities. Really, like what's in first place in our lives or what's in last place in our lives. Whether or not we choose to embrace some kind of religious tradition or faith, what our values are, what we say and how we go about saying it, and what we do and how we go about doing those very things. So our worldview touches everything in our life. But the fact is that because our worldview is so important to us, it's so important about what makes us or what makes us who we are. It's important that at times we take good care of it, right? That we try to determine what it is that is affecting our worldview. And especially in our day and age, it's important that we have an objective standard for truth. We have something that guides us and leads us through life, something that is unchanging. Because if we don't have something that is unchanging, that guides our life, then what happens is that our worldview is then at the mercy of the culture or the spirit of the age. Where maybe we get to a point in our lives or in culture, right, that there are things that are said that are called right that are now wrong, or things that were wrong. This is kind of a worse place to be, is things that were wrong but now are right. And so that's why it's so important that we take care of the things that influence us, the things that affect, right, how we think, and then how it is that we actually live. And so culture is surrounding us, and culture is all around us, trying to persuade us to believe certain things. Now, not all of that things of culture are bad, right? I mean, there are many good things in culture, but we can all, if we're all honest with ourselves, we can all realize the negative things that are in our culture that try to affect us in really negative ways. Now, we take, for example, from the Bible of a man named Daniel. Now, Daniel is a book of 12 chapters, and we're going to spend the next 12 weeks going through this book. It's going to take us through the summer, and when we actually resume in person, we'll begin another series, but we'll be spending some time in the book of Daniel. And now Daniel is a man that is very familiar with the situation that we find ourselves in, or what we're talking about today. And many of you might know who Daniel is. He's spoken of in other faith traditions. But Daniel is probably most known for the story of the lion's den. When he is thrown into this lion's den by the king and sentenced to death, and by a great miracle of God protects him while he's there, and he is then released, right? And then the king then worships his God, the God of the Bible, Yahweh God. So that's what he's most famous for. But other people might look at the book of Daniel and begin to see how maybe, or perhaps, it speaks to a lot of things that are maybe happening in our current time, or maybe things that are going to happen in the future. And this is commonly known as sort of like eschatology or end times theology. And theology is just like the study of God, right? So end times theories. So a lot of people may, to some extent, obsess over this fact that it may speak to end times things. And right or wrong, I'm not going to discuss that at this point, whether they're right or wrong. But I think this might miss the entire point of this book. And what we'll find in this chapter and chapters to follow is that the book of Daniel really tells us and really tries to hit home the truth that God is in control. That God is in control when culture is all around us trying to pressure us, right, into fitting a certain mold, or believing the things that it calls right, or believing the things that it calls wrong. Right? God is still in control. But then as we read along, we'll find that there are these images of these kingdoms that are coming, these future kingdoms, or maybe kingdoms that have already passed, and they're very brutal kingdoms. And in the midst of all those things, no matter how all of this is going to pan out in the end, if it speaks to those issues, right, God is still in control. And that's really what we should take away from the book of Daniel, is that ultimately God is going to be in control no matter what our circumstances might be. And so we turn to the book of Daniel, chapter 1, verses 1 through 21. And we'll read it together. And here's how it begins. It says, "In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God." And so immediately we're thrown into a real time and a real place in history. Right? We're told we're coming into the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah. And now Judah might be unfamiliar to many of us because for the last few weeks and through most of the things we talk about when we talk about God or talk about the Bible, we often mention the name Israel. Now, at one point in history, Israel was divided into 2 kingdoms, the northern kingdom of Samaria and the southern kingdom of Judah. And at this point in history, the southern kingdom of Judah is all that's left of the people of Israel, everybody has either been destroyed or taken into exile. And so we have the kingdom of Judah, which is left. And this all begins, if you're a history person, around 605 BC, and it culminates with the destruction of Judah in 586 BC by Nebuchadnezzar. And so that's where we find ourselves in this at this point in the conflict that is happening. And so we read that Nebuchadnezzar, he besieges this town. And we think, wow, well, where's God in all of this? But the following verse, in verse 2, tells us that the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into Nebuchadnezzar's hand. And so if you're familiar with a lot of the events that occur before this book, you know that God's people have been very disobedient to God. And so this is God's judgment upon his own people for their own sin of idolatry that was so rampant in the nation. Right? They were worshiping other gods when they were only supposed to worship him. So this is the judgment that is coming upon them. Then we go on in verse 3. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that, they were to enter the king's service. And so we realize that Nebuchadnezzar has acquired more than just stuff. Right? He's also acquired human capital. Right? He's decided that he is going to take some of the best young men of the land and bring them into his service. And so we're talking about sort of a 3-year enculturation of everything Babylon. So we see they're going to learn the history, the language, the literature. They're going to learn everything there is to know about Babylon. And Nebuchadnezzar had sort of a twofold goal in all of this, is that by enculturating or brainwashing these young men, right, these young men that were completely perfect, or at least perfect in his eyes, they would come into Babylon for these 3 years, learn everything there is to know, and then be sent back, some of them would be, sent back to Judah, and they'd basically be a propaganda tool. They would begin to talk about how great Babylon is. Right? So this was a way for Nebuchadnezzar to control Judah without actually taking it over at this point. And then the second reason is that he would have really good people in his royal court. People that would do his will in the kingdom. And so that was his goal in doing all of this. And then we get to verse 6. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah Shadrach, to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego. So already we see this enculturation happening. So it wasn't good enough for Nebuchadnezzar for these people from Judah, these Israelites, to come into the kingdom in his service having their own names. He decides to change their names. And as you all know, names in the Old Testament and even into the New Testament, names are important. Right? Names in that culture were important. And if you had a Hebrew name, most often or most likely, they were short sentences that were giving glory or praise to Yahweh God, to the God of the Bible. But now their name is being changed to something that Nebuchadnezzar finds suitable. And more than likely, their names were now a praise and glory to the the gods of Babylon. Right? So it's not enough just for them to learn the language, learn the literature, learn the history. But now their whole name is going to be changed, right? Who they're called, right? And maybe it defines who they are. All of that is being changed right in front of them. But we're giving a really cool sentence that happens after this, really cool word. Verse 8, it says, But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. And he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Now God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel. But the official told Daniel, I am afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you." Verse 11, Daniel then said to the guard whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, "Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see." So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. And at the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. And to these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. And so this is one of the more famous circumstances or events we find Daniel in the middle of. He is going to be given the choice food of the kingdom and wine, but yet he knows that this is a place where he's going to draw the line. Right? He's not going to allow himself to be defiled by this food. So instead he says, give me vegetables instead. And so this other official around him said, we can't have you looking worse off than everybody else. And so this is where Daniel, again, draws the line and says, well, let's have a test. Right? If I, at the end of this 10 days, you'll see how these vegetables have worked in me. And so the official finds that at the end of that Daniel and his friends, because they've eaten these vegetables, they actually look much better than the other guys that are being enculturated in these 3 years. And so then the vegetables becomes the choice food for all of these men in this sort of program. Now, some may look at this story and try to interpret maybe what's happening here. Why did Daniel say that he didn't want to defile himself? Now, there's several things that we can gather from this. Is that maybe Daniel decided in his own mind, well, I know this food is going to be offered up to idols, and so I am not going to partake of it. This food was given up for other gods. I don't want to partake of any of that, because if I do that, it's going to defile me. Others may say that maybe the food that was offered was going to break the Jewish food code, which either of these two opinions could be right as well. But I am more of the opinion that perhaps Daniel was sort of taking a stand here against the culture. We look at Daniel and he's saying, I'm going to not partake of this food, right? Because by taking of this food that they were giving him, right, he would then be reliant upon this king, be reliant upon Nebuchadnezzar for his satisfaction or for his sustenance. So by then taking the vegetables, right, taking the food that they were not given, right, this other food, right, he was then relying on God for his needs, relying on God for his sustenance. And so I think any of those views may be correct, right? We can't put ourselves quite there in that situation. But we just know, and I think I would conclude from that, is that Daniel knew where to draw the line in the culture of where what he was going to say is going to defile him if he partakes of it, if he embraces it. And then verse 18, at the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. So chapter 1 really gives us sort of an introduction to the rest of the story. And the way it ends there with King Cyrus, that's about 538 BC. Again, if you really like history, you can go and read a lot of the history behind all of these events that have occurred. Now, for any one of us, those of us who have kids or have had kids, and some of us were all kids at some point, if you've ever sit in front of TV for long enough or sit your kid in front of TV for long enough, you find that they pick up a lot of things that they hear on television. For example, our daughter, we let her watch, throughout the day sometimes, watch this TV show called Daniel Tiger. And as she's watching the show, there are some songs that come on that really try to help her deal with emotions and deal with real life circumstances that she's going to face as a kid. For example, there might be in the story, there might be a kid who takes a toy from another kid, and the kid who got stolen from gets angry. And so they sing a song, about this, and I can't quite remember this particular song, but they sing a song about how to deal with the emotion that you're sensing or feeling at that moment. And so every now and then we'll hear our daughter sing this very song, whether it's in the right circumstance, she's just, she does get angry and she sings it, or she's just walking around and playing and decides to sing some of these songs. So these songs are etched in her brain, right? It's something that her brain has attached to, right? And she sings it now. She might sing it a week from now, a year from now, but it's something that she's always going to remember. So we find positive things like that attach themselves to our brains, right? And we remember them for years to come. Now, whether we realize it or not, whether we acknowledge it or not, there's a culture around us, right, that's trying to shape our minds. There's a belief system around us that is trying to mold our minds into a specific thing. And this happens from birth up to the present time. Right? In this shaping, in this molding, right, it affects our worldview. It's a vital piece of who it is that we are and how it is that we navigate this life. There's a saying that I'm not sure if you're familiar with, but is that it goes like this: as a person thinks, so they live. Right? So how it is, however our brains work, how it is that we think, translates into how we navigate this life, how we live this life out. We look at Daniel. We look at his life. And I think it's easy for us to look at, or easy for us to think, that when we see that he's going into these 3 years of, maybe job training, that's at least what we think we would call it. We think it's job training. But actually, what was going on here is complete enculturation. This was a complete shaping of the mind. Nebuchadnezzar's hope was that at the end of this 3 years, he would own these people. I'm sure there's some examples you can find throughout history where maybe when a king or a people is trying to conquer another people, they may capture them physically, but yet there's going to be continuous rebellion and all of these things. But yet when you control someone's mind, right, you have really controlled the person, the whole person, right, and you own them. And this is what we see going on here, right? This attempt of Nebuchadnezzar to not only own these people physically, but also to own these people in their minds. And so in controlling their minds, Nebuchadnezzar would control then how they lived, right? Completely shaping their worldview. Now maybe a question that you've thought about before, or maybe you haven't thought about it very often, but do you know how you've come to believe what it is you believe? When you really think about your worldview, can you go back in time and trace all the thoughts that have entered your mind, all the things that have influenced you to get you to this point in your life? How did you come to believe what it is you now believe? It's kind of scary to think about it. Because from birth to this time in our life, there are so many things that have become a part of our worldview. Right? There are things around us, whether we think so or not, that are affecting our worldview. Now, if you're living in this world, our minds are being shaped and molded. But the worldview of our culture, right, isn't in some book somewhere. Now, yeah, you can read a book, and you can find some ideas of maybe philosophers or psychologists who try to nail down what it is our culture actually believes. But I'm not sure if we find it just in one book. You're going to find it all over the place in the TV shows that you watch, in the news that you watch, in the magazines that you read, and yes, also the books that you also read. They tell us what to think. And we often embrace these ideas because a lot of these ideas really play on our deep desires. And as followers of God, we would often call these things sinful desires. A lot of the things we see in our culture play at those things, and so we embrace them, right? We bring them into our worldview. We incorporate them into our life without really knowing it. Now take, for example, the news. In our our politically charged, highly politically charged culture, we find that the news wants to tell us what to believe. You can have, for instance, Fox News and CNN both report on the very same story and have two people, right, go into a different room and watch those news stories, one by Fox News, one by CNN, and then you're going to have them come out of those rooms, and these people are going to have very different opinions about the same story that they watched. Right? So our culture is really trying to sway our opinion. Or take, for example, the person who falls into lust or falls into some affair. Many of us might look at them and say, well, they're just weak. They just can't control their selfish and sinful desires. But what if that's not really to blame? And I'm sure I'm saying that they made the mistake, so they would be to blame for it. But where in culture would they see that? They would get this idea from our culture that says that, that's really highly sexualized, that makes it okay to do something like that, that there are really no consequences to that. And the sad fact is that there's so many things that are affecting our worldview and also affecting the way that we live. For followers of God, it's no surprise that we find ourselves in a culture whose worldview is hostile to the gospel. We realize that the God of our culture is not the God of the Bible. Some of you may be familiar with the idea of secular humanism. And really what that idea gets at is that we really don't need God in life. That humans can attain morality, can figure out or determine what's right and wrong without God. And that humans can also fulfill themselves. They can attain self-fulfillment without God. And if you're a follower of Jesus or know anything about the Bible, you would know that that idea is completely opposed, right, in direct conflict to the Bible. And now as followers of Jesus, I find that we usually, in a hostile culture or a culture that can be toxic at times, right, I think we really have three responses. And maybe there are more, but I think we naturally have three responses to the culture that we face. And the first of these is hostility. We look at the culture and we take things to extreme in an attempt to make the culture Christian. Right? We're fighting this uphill battle, and I know some of these things, we're trying to bring some Christian values into the world. I think some of that is a worthy pursuit. But I think a lot of this hostility then leads to doing more harm than actual good. For example, you can go to any major city, and what you'll find is some what we call street preachers. And these guys will put a sign on their shoulders, and they will walk around with a megaphone telling everybody, you're going to hell, you're going to hell, you're going to hell. Now, there is some truth to that statement that these street preachers are doing, but that's probably doing more harm than good. That is an attempt to try to force Christian values onto a godless culture. Right? We're trying to get a godless culture to follow God's law, which they're probably not going to do anyway. But then yet you have extremes in every religious tradition, and you find in Christianity that you'll find some extreme Christians who will go and bomb an abortion clinic or go and try to kill an abortion doctor. You have all of these kinds of stories that happen here in the United States and probably around the world because Christians become so hostile to the culture that they go to such extremes and they do more harm than good. So we are hostile. So hostility is the first of these. Second is that we embrace this culture. We look at the culture and think to ourselves that, all these other belief systems that are out there, they're not hurting me personally. Right? The person who disagrees with me on some real truth here, right? They disagree with me, and that's okay. It's not hurting me for them to believe that. I'm not hurt personally. So everyone is then free to believe what it is that they want. And if you have been in philosophy for any amount of time, or you might call yourself a philosopher of some sort, there's this idea of subjective truth. And now subjective truth says that everyone basically is correct, that nobody is wrong. But yet when you put even all the faith traditions up against each other, you're going to find that there are some contradictions among the faith traditions. And so somebody has got to be wrong. And that's why it's so important to lean into objective truth rather than subjective truth. And now this idea of embracing the culture has been somewhat harmful in Christian traditions. With this whole idea of homosexuality that it's okay for maybe a pastor or maybe someone who leads a church to be homosexual. And that's been a topic that is dividing one of the biggest denominations or groups of churches that we have here in the United States over that simple idea. So, we're hostile. We embrace the culture. But followers ought to be different, right, than other people in this world, which leads us then to discernment. As the third thing that I think we see here with Daniel. Because Daniel's struggle wasn't that he was trying to make this Babylonian culture Christian. I think the struggle was that how was he to live in light of a hostile culture? And I think we see this in his story because he knew where to draw the line in this culture. He knew what was ultimately going to defile him if he didn't. Now, I think the question for us then is that how do we determine what has a right and wrong or a good and bad consequence for our worldview? How do we become more aware of what we're taking in that shapes our mind, that shapes the way we think, then shapes the way we live? If we rely on culture, I'm not sure if I've been clear enough, but I think you can probably conclude this just by looking at our own culture. That if your worldview is completely based on our culture, right, you're at the mercy of the ebb and flow of our culture. So if there's a point in time where there's something that is morally wrong that then becomes right in the culture, you have no other choice but to lean into that new reality and embrace that new moral standard. And so what we really need is we need objective truth. Paul tells us, the Apostle Paul tells us in Colossians 2, verse 8, he says, "See to it that no one takes you captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy, which depends on human tradition and the elemental spiritual forces of this world rather than on Christ." And so we might find that our worldview is being completely shaped and molded by our culture, right? So it's been taken captive. But he encourages us or tells us in Romans chapter 12, verse 2, he says, "Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." In order to be able to do that, again, we have to have objective truth. We have to have a guide for truth. And that's where the Bible comes in. You know, the biblical witness, or the Bible tells us in many verses that we are to be people that are in the world, but we are not to be of the world. We are to be very different from the world. Someone should be able to look at you, the things that you say, the things that you do, and know that you're different, that you are not the same as everybody else on this world, that there's something that makes you completely different. But we need this objective truth. We need the Bible to guide us in all of life, to know what it is, or to discern, right, what's coming in, what's shaping us, what is molding us. Because when we do that, the Bible then becomes the lens through which we see everything in our culture, everything in our world. So we put different aspects of our culture in front of this lens. So we put the Bible right in front of us, right? So I can take the Bible here. So this is the lens through which I see these things in culture, right? So I put up this highly sexualized culture that we live in. I look at it through the lens of the Bible, and I realize it's in direct conflict with it. It's in opposition to that. Because I read in the Bible that everyone is unique. Everyone's been created in God's image. Everyone has value. Nobody should be devalued, right, because they're a woman or because they are a man, right? This highly sexualized culture tells us the opposite of what the Bible tells us. So because I see it this way through this lens, then I can completely reject that aspect of the culture. Or we put up our highly politically charged culture in front of this lens, right? We realize that this political culture that we're in is causing so much division. But the Bible always talks about being in unity with each other. Right? As much as it depends on you, be at peace with one another, is what we're told in the book of Romans. Right? So we look at it through this lens of the Bible. We can completely reject it because it's in complete contradiction. It's in complete opposition, right, to the Bible. We put up our consumeristic pieces of the culture, right, where it tells us that we can be satisfied by the accumulation of stuff. But we look at that through the lens of the Bible, right? And the Bible tells us that acquiring things that are going to rust, that are going to be destroyed, right? There's no fulfillment to be found in those things. So we realize that our sufficiency ultimately comes from God. So we reject that aspect of the culture. We reject the consumerism of our culture. Or we look at the fact that our world tells us that we as humans, this secular humanism, that we can be self-sufficient, that we don't need anybody else in life, let alone actually need God. Yet we look at the Bible, right? And we look at it, this as our lens at this self-sufficiency aspect of our culture. We realize it's in direct conflict to the Bible, right? And so we reject it because the Bible tells us of our great need for God, that each and every one of us is a sinner lost in this world, right? And it's only God who can truly find us, right, and bring us into new life. We can't do that on our own. Only God can do that. So the culture affects the way that we think, right? And then thus affects the way that we actually live. It's even more important in our age to be able to discern, right, what it is that's coming in to us, right, that is molding and shaping our minds. And the only thing that can really help us to do that is something that is true, something that is objective, something that never fails, something that's always truthful. And that is the Word of God. It's only through God's Word that we can realize how much of our culture is in complete opposition to what is really right in the world. Let's pray. God, thank you so much for this time that you've given us. Thank you, Lord, that you've given us the tools to be able to discern what it is that we should be taking into our lives, taking in that shapes our minds, that guides the way we think, and then guides the way that we live. Thank you that you've given us your word to be the lens through which we see the things in our culture, the things that we can reject and those things that we can accept. I pray, Lord, that you'd help each and every one of us as we journey through this life, whether we're followers of Jesus or not. I think we can all, if we're honest with ourselves, realize how much our culture tries to affect us, especially in very negative ways. I pray, God, that you would help us to lean more into your word and to not trust into the things of this world, to be completely controlled, right, or captivated by this world's order, but instead be captivated by your word, by your thoughts. Because we know that it's our thoughts that then dictate the way we live. Help us, Lord, to live more for you than for the world. In Jesus' name, amen.